I mean, stem cells are platform technology.
This is a $1 trillion platform. Like, if we're like, 65% of Irish exports are pharmaceuticals. That's something like, I think it's like 40 or 60 billion of our exports every year of pharmaceuticals. I didn't know that. Like, that's like 50% of our national product. More than 50% is pharmaceuticals, drugs, devices. Now, as science moves forward towards using regenerative medicine and kind of cell-based technologies, which it's going to take a while, but if we are not in a position to allow those companies that manufacture those products here, we are at massive risk of losing those companies doing it here. Because why should they do it here? They're not, if they're like in a legislative vacuum where they don't know whether some intellectual property based in, you know, a decision that was made 20 years ago and some patent owned by someone in America means that this is actually based on an idea that came from an embryonic technology, which means that all of your technology is now based on embryonic technology. And because Ireland doesn't allow that, that means Pfizer can't operate here. Because let's say they acquired a technology that was originated from that kind of an initial intellectual property position. So unfortunately, the only things that that I believe those guys will listen to is the economic argument. The people argument is great when you have people. So if you can mobilize people to complain about this, which I think that, you know, that's why I'm here, you know, like, because I know that this is the situation. That's why I'm involved with Stephen, and we work together on this because it's just it's a no-brainer to do this. Like, I mean,
I think two points. I think the idea that embryonic and adult can be separated is more or less a fallacy. It's kind of something that comes out of fundamentalism rather than science. When you understand the way science and research works, you understand that different areas cross-pollinate each other constantly. And the second point I'd make is that we've got a very ethically and legally inconsistent view of the use of embryo cells in research. So, for example, you have embryo cells that are not stem cells that are almost without regulation and are used widely throughout Irish labs. And so they're from embryos, so they have the same ethical considerations or similar ethical considerations to embryonic stem cells. It's very important that we realize that, you know, stem cells are a platform technology. We need to legislate for that platform technology if we're serious in dealing with human disease.
Scotland have a great biotech business because of that.
But who pushed it forward? Why did they do it?
I think there's a stronger scientific and medical heritage in the UK. So, for example, you know, organisations already exist there that would push these kind of issues directly to the government. And there's a lot of scientific and medical poster boys and poster girls that, you know, enthuse the public at large. And I think that's something that, because we're a small island and, you know, until relatively recently we didn't put large amounts of money into science and medicine, that, you know, it hasn't happened.
Scientists, you know, on television or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, we've Steve.
Yeah, but I'm not built for TV. I'm more of a radio man. But seriously though, I think, you know, what Ireland is doing very well at the moment is promoting science. But what it's not very good at is communicating science. And there's a slight difference there. You know, you can have a project that's funded by a government agency and, wow, look at this is really cool. But ultimately what you really want the public to understand is like why it's cool and how it's cool. So, you know, for example, there was some letters going around in the Irish Times there in the last few weeks with David McConnell from Trinity and Tom Cotter, you know, pinpointing the difference between promoting science and communicating or educating about science. And I think that's something that needs to be worked on a bit more, up with the science policy as well, because if we don't have the right science policy, I think it's kind of unfair to advertise science as a career to Irish graduates if they're handicapped by a lack of legislation.
And I think as well, we're a very conservative country, and we have been controlled in the past a lot by the church, I would say. And I think that it's been incredibly easy for the government to just use that route to not bother dealing with these things.
I would say that it actually is not a theological or ideological thing. I think it's just we don't have a good precedent for bringing these kind of issues before the government in a real way, because you take lots of other areas of medicine, like assisted fertility, adoption, and these are areas they're difficult areas to legislate for, but they should be legislated for. There should be transparency. It's important that we mature as a society and come to a decision about things that aren't simple.
Yeah, and in this day and age, right, like where so much of the workforce now, it's quite clear that I think that it's the knowledge economy, as they like to call it, right? Like it's the high value add that will create value within this country. The kind of more intellectual kind of work is where the real value can be generated especially for a country like Ireland that is so small, and we don't have any massive industry. To not put us on an equal footing with the rest of the world in this area, and yet invest in it, or think that we're going to compete in any way with the rest of the world. Crazy.
You could have one of those clinics that you're talking about in Ecuador open in Ireland. There's nothing to stop it.
No, I don't think so. I think the Irish Medicines Board can effectively manage it, because we're a small country. Word gets out,
okay,
and they get slammed down pretty quick now.
Okay.
I mean, there was a, Ireland might be, not the best in terms of being aware of what stem cells can do, but the government are good in that one area in closing stuff down quickly, and I think that's a large part. It is one of our advantages in being a small country.
You hear about things.
Yeah. The way I think about the stem cell field at the moment is it's very analogous to the early days of surgery, or the realization that physicians could understand what killed a patient by doing an autopsy. It's very controversial at the beginning, and at the beginning, there was a lot of there was no law, no regulation, so you had these kind of Burke and Hare stories in Edinburgh where bodies were being stolen, and then over time they developed better regulation, so that you could donate cadavers to medical research and for example, and now we wouldn't think anything about someone going in and getting their appendix out, or an autopsy, or post-mortem being done on a person in order to identify what they died of. But so we're at the stage where stem cells have some clinical utility. The scientists can see, just because it's a platform technology, that it's going to really feed into every area going. I think it's going to be very, very important to neuroscience in the next decade for sure. But we need strong public debate to understand it and have good policy and law related to it, because if we don't, I think it'll slow up the research. This is what's happening worldwide at the moment. People like me, and I'm just a researcher, I have to deal with lots of other things that aren't really related directly to the research. In an ideal world, the researcher would just be in a lab doing experiments, but we need public education. We need the patient advocates to explain to the public what we're doing and why we're doing it, and that's something that's very important. I wouldn't have got anywhere if Martin hadn't helped me out in trying to explain what we're actually trying to achieve to the public at large. Because if I stand up and say stem cells, you say, yeah, he's a scientist, he's got a vested interest, I don't really care about what he has to say on the subject. But if Martin's kind of starts talking, then people will naturally put themselves in Martin's position, and then the real kind of thought process begins to develop.
Stephen, what do you think in the Irish context is the biggest barrier? Is it the political will, or is it the scientific will? Is there a unified, I know there'd never be a totally unified medical scientific voice, that's not possible, but is there a largely unified voice, or is the resistance from the scientific community a bigger problem than the political will?
I think ultimately that there are some scientists who are also fundamentalists who present half the story and not the other half. They are a problem, but I think ultimately they're not a big problem because, for example, you'll watch CNN and you see Obama, taking a big political risk to make sure that American scientists have access to stem cells, embryonic stem cells. So you see the outside world, and this is one of the key things that the foundation wanted to do, was not to get involved in fights with ideological or fundamentalist groups, but rather just open the window and say, look, this is what's happening. So, for example, in the last few weeks we've had a genetic kind of blindness that is showing very interesting results in clinical trials. Stem cells are made into the cell type that's affected in the disease. They put it in, and legally blind patients, and these are stage 1 clinical trials, are showing sight improvement. And this it's very early days, and there's much more work to be done. But I think the battle will get easier as more and more medical benefits become evident to the public.